In this video, we're going to prepare a basic accounts receivable aging schedule. We'll examine how management's estimate of uncollectible accounts impacts its bad debt expense, that is, if management is overly optimistic or pessimistic regarding the collections of accounts receivable. How does that impact the current year's bad debt expense? And then we'll also examine how the prior year's estimated bad debt expense impacts the current year's bad debt expense. In other words, if in the prior year management was overly optimistic, how will that impact the current year bad debt expense? Let's begin by preparing our basic accounts receivable aging schedule. We're going to examine two scenarios. Scenario A, where we have estimated collections or write-offs of current receivables of 1%, things that are from 1 to 30 days past due, 5% estimated uncollectible. Anything that's 31 to 90 days past due will be estimated as 25% uncollectible. And then finally, anything that's over 90 days past due, we're estimating that only 50% of that will collect. And then we'll examine scenario B, where we notice management is more pessimistic regarding future collections. We'll examine our bad debt expense and our allowance for doubtful accounts under both of these scenarios. We begin with our aging schedule by taking our total accounts receivable balance of $50,000 and breaking it into various buckets or pools relative to how old each of the receivables is. Notice the 35, the 5, the 8, and the 2 adds up to our total 50,000. Next, we multiply the accounts receivable in each one of those brackets or buckets by our estimated uncollectible percentage. 1% of 35,000 is $350. 5% of 5,000 is $250. 25% of 8,000 is $2,000, and finally 50% of 2,000 is $1,000. Next, we sum together all of these allowances for each one of the buckets, bringing us to a total estimated bad debt related to our current receivables of $3,600, which means on our balance sheet we would want to show net accounts receivable of $46,400. That's our accounts receivable minus the allowance for doubtful accounts. We're told that our current allowance balance has a $500 credit, which means our adjusting entry will need to be for $3,100. That's the $3,600 required credit balance minus the current $500 credit balance. Let's go ahead and take a look now at scenario B, where we're using a slightly more pessimistic percentages for our estimated uncollectible accounts. Again, 1% times 35,000 is $350. Now we're multiplying the 5,000 by 10%, which gives us 500. The 8,000 gets multiplied by 30% for 2,400, and the 2,000 by 60% for 1,200. Our total estimated allowance for doubtful accounts then is $4,450, and we would want to show on our balance sheet a net accounts receivable of $45,550. Again, that's our accounts receivable minus our estimated allowance for doubtful accounts of $4,450. This means our journal entry will be $3,950. We need a credit balance of $4,450, and since we already have $500 credit balance, the adjustment is $3,950. Notice in scenario B, when we use slightly more pessimistic assumptions regarding collections of accounts receivable, will result in a higher bad debt expense for the current year. Now we're going to examine how the prior year's bad debt expense will impact the current year's bad debt expense. In scenarios C and D, we're using the same estimated percentages for uncollectible accounts. The differences are in our ending allowance for doubtful accounts balance prior to making our adjusting entry. In scenario C, we're assuming we have a $700 debit balance, which means last year management did not set aside enough in the allowance for doubtful accounts. In scenario D, we're assuming a $500 credit balance in the allowance for doubtful accounts before we make our adjusting entry, which means that management set aside more than enough. For both scenarios, we'll multiply the $35,000 by 1% for $350, the $5,000 by 5% for $250, the $8,000 by 25% for $2,000, and the $2,000 gets multiplied by 50% for $1,000. In both scenarios, we want an ending balance in our allowance for doubtful accounts of $3,600. And in both scenarios, we're going to report net accounts receivable on our balance sheet in the amount of $46,400. But now let's take a look at how last year's estimated allowance impacts this year's bad debt expense. For scenario C, where we have a $700 debit balance, we're going to need a credit to the allowance for doubtful accounts of $4,300 to bring the balance up to our required $3,600 balance. On the other hand, in scenario D, where we have a $500 credit balance, we will only require an adjustment of $3,100 to bring our allowance up to our required $3,600. Thus, we can see when management is overly optimistic concerning collections of current year's accounts receivable, we will have a lower estimated uncollectible amount, and we will report a lower bad debt expense for the current year, $3,100 versus $39,050 or $3,950. If we assume the same estimated uncollectible accounts for the current year, then prior year's estimated allowance will impact the current year's expense. A debit balance of $700 indicates that management didn't set aside enough last year in the allowance for doubtful accounts. So the current year's expense, $4,300, will be higher than our estimated uncollectible accounts related to the current year's receivables. On the other hand, if management set aside more than enough and was overly pessimistic last year and set aside too big of an allowance, and there's a credit balance remaining, then the current year expense of $3,100 is less than the estimated allowance related to current year's sales.